Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 10 about media and politics. It's Lesson 4 about online news. In this lesson, you'll learn about online news producers, about citizen journalists, about online news distributors, about viral news, and about the dominance of Drudge. When we're talking about online news, we're talking about online news sites such as CNN, Daily Beast, Yahoo News, things like that. Now, to more systematically talk about them, we're going to divide them up into two categories. We're first going to discuss online news producers, and then secondly discuss online news distributors. Now, you notice here on this slide the two boxes that I have are different colors. The slides that follow will be one color or the other, so you can keep track of which of these two categories we're talking about. Online news producers are websites online that create original news content of their own, with their own reporters and writers. Now, of the online news producers, there are two categories, what we can call affiliated websites and independent websites. Affiliated news websites are internet versions of news companies that exist elsewhere. For example, you could have a newspaper that actually distributes physical copies of its newspaper and then also has an internet site where it posts its stories for readers to see too. So affiliated websites are ones that are somehow connected to some other news medium out there. A couple of examples of affiliated news sites are the New York Times website at nytimes.com and CNN's website at cnn.com. These are basically online versions of either the newspaper or the television station. Here's an example you can see with the CNN website. Now, this is very typical of what online news producers' websites look like. Whether it's the New York Times or CNN or some other online news producer, their website's going to look kind of similar to this. There's going to be links to various stories that they've created. You can see that in the left-hand column here. There's going to be links to videos, as you can see in the center of the page. It's going to be an access to various news materials that they have created, laid out somewhat like you would expect a newspaper to be. That's why sometimes these are called online newspapers, even if they aren't actually affiliated with a newspaper. But we're calling them online news producers to be more general as we describe them. In addition to those affiliated websites, there are also independent news websites. Now, these look very much the same, and they're doing the same sort of thing. They're producing hard news, is generally what they're trying to do, for people to see in a newspaper sort of format. The difference is these independent news websites are not affiliated, not part of some broader organization that produces news in other mediums also, such as print or television. Instead, they are online-only products. They're doing the same sort of thing, but they're doing it only online. Examples of those are Yahoo News and the website Politico, which focuses on political news exclusively. Now, I'm not going to bother to show you an example of what these websites look like because, as I said, they're very similar to what I already showed you with the CNN webpage. In addition to these professional news organizations that create websites, whether affiliated or independent, you also find news on the internet from citizen journalists. Now, this is a form of independent online news. Citizen journalists aren't affiliated with some media company that's doing other things like producing newspapers or television shows. But they're also not affiliated with independent online news products either. Instead, these are individuals that are creating their own news content, oftentimes just out there with a cell phone, filming what goes on around them, then posting it perhaps to social media or to a blog, or submitting it to one of these other news sites for them to put up. An example of citizen journalism is the prevalence now that we've seen of people filming confrontations between police officers and suspects. Some of the most famous examples of this are when people have filmed not just arrests, but even fatal police shootings. Here we have the specific example, the shooting of Alton Sterling, that took place in 2016 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Multiple cell phone videos were taken of this incident, including by a group that calls itself Stop the Killing, which systematically monitors police scanners to know where the police are at and what they're doing and where a confrontation might take place, so they can rush out and then film it. This is another way that online news content is produced, but in this case it's being produced by amateurs rather than professionals that are part of some news organization. But whether it's these amateurs or professional, what's taking place when we're talking about online news producers is they are creating news content for people to see. But there's another kind of online news site where rather than employing or just volunteering to employing people or having volunteers make news content, instead what the websites are doing is they're simply distributing, making available content that already exists. So when we talk about online news distributors, we're talking about websites that connect the audience to online content that's been created by other people, rather than producing the content themselves. So online distributor websites can be categorized as either what we call news aggregators or as social media sites. News aggregators are sites that provide continually updated links to stories that they've gathered in, or in other words, aggregated from other sources. So you go to a news aggregator site and you will find a bunch of connections, links, to stories that you'll find elsewhere on the internet that have been created by other news companies, websites, corporations, whatever it may be. Not by the website where you're finding the links. The website that is a news aggregation website is simply connecting you to those other sources of news. A couple of examples of news aggregator sites are one site called realclearpolitics.com and another one called instapundit.com. Let me show you a little bit of what these sites look like and what they do as they aggregate the news for us. First of all, here's a screen capture from Real Clear Politics. What Real Clear Politics does is every day it provides a new list of stories that the editors for the site have selected that they think might be particularly interesting. Now, this web page is from several years ago in 2012, during the time of the 2012 presidential election. And so you can see here that they have a bunch of stories about that presidential election. Some stories about Obama, some stories about Romney, who were the candidates at the time. Real Clear Politics tries very hard to balance out the stories that it presents, provide a little bit of each side on the controversial issues of the day, whatever they may be. It has categories of things that you can go to. You can see in the left-hand column there, it had a category about the battle for the White House, another category about the U.S. economy. And then it has daily lists of stories. You can see over there in the main section of the site, these are links for Thursday, September 27th, that the editors of the site found interesting. So Real Clear Politics is a great place to go to just get a taste of what's being talked about in the political world at any given moment. But what Real Clear Politics is really good at is keeping people informed about public opinion polls. There's a whole section of the Real Clear Politics website that keeps track of all the polling that's going on and provides very useful charts where you can track polling over time. Here's an example of polling being tracked leading up to the 2016 presidential election. At this particular point in time, in April preceding the election, you can see that it's showing Hillary Clinton with a healthy lead over Donald Trump. But you could also, on this site backtrack over time and see how the candidates were faring against each other over the course of the campaign. Now, it doesn't just do this for the presidential election, but it does it for all other major elections out there, such as for senators, governors, things like that. It does presidential election possibilities for various states of who's going to get the electors there, things like that. There's a lot of detail there. So if you're a person who's interested in this kind of coverage, about who's ahead or behind in some particular race, this is the kind of website that you'd want to go to keep track of that. But again, notice, they aren't the producers of this news. They aren't the ones that went out and did the polls. They're simply aggregating the information here. In the case of polls, they're averaging for us, but they are not producing the information. Another example of a news aggregation website is Instapundit. This is a website run primarily by an individual. It started out as his private blog, a guy named Glenn Reynolds, who is a law professor in Tennessee. And while he has other people that come in and help him with it, it's still mainly him just selecting stories that he finds interesting and then posting them one at a time with just a little bit of commentary beside them, explaining why he thinks they're interesting. This is a kind of website that has actually become fairly common, where a person or a small group of people maintain a blog together and just post links and short comments about things that they find interesting. And then they develop a following, an audience that comes to them to find out what's going on in the world. So if you happen to have a news taste similar to that of Glenn Reynolds, you don't have to be surfing around the internet looking for the things that will be interesting. You can simply go to his website, and he's already done it for you, and you can click on the links that he's provided. Another mechanism for distributing political news is social media. Social media is the mechanism over the internet whereby people can exchange information with other individuals or small communities that they link up with, rather than passing through some big media company. Now, what I mean by this, what I call unmediated here on this slide, is that rather than the information having to pass through CNN.com or through NewYorkTimes.com or whatever it may be, instead you can pass it directly to your friend or neighbor. That's what social media allows you to do, and it's another way for information, news information, particularly political information, to be passed around from person to person over the internet. The two most prominent social media websites as of the time of making the slideshow are Facebook and Twitter, that each have millions or even billions of people signed up to them. And so people can have broad communities that they can link to through these websites to share things of interest and receive things from other people. For some people, the political information that's distributed over social media is their only contact with political news. So social media becomes very important for them to keep track of what's going on in the political world. The internet, and social media in particular, has given rise to what's known as viral news. This is where stories, for one reason or another, catch fire, getting passed from one person to another, and they spread quickly to extremely wide audiences, in a manner similar to how a virus spreads through a population. And although social scientists have studied this, and political thinkers have studied this, we haven't yet figured out what really triggers viral news to happen. Some things just seem to catch on and spread, and other things don't. Politicians really wish they could figure this out so that they could tailor their messages to spread virally. But they've had limited success in that way. Perhaps Donald Trump, who was elected president in 2016, has been the most successful, simply by being really controversial in the things he puts on social media, thus getting that passed around. And it's not necessarily true that other politicians will be willing to do that. Nonetheless, it happens. Political stories suddenly catch on and they spread. And in that way, these individual news items can be widely dispersed among the population. Now, of all the kinds of websites that I've talked about in this lesson, the most important of all of them is a internet site called the Drudge Report. Now, you may not have even heard of the Drudge Report, so you may be asking, well, why is it so important? Well, it wouldn't be obvious how important it is by simply going and visiting it, which I recommend you do. You should be aware of it. If you go to the Drudge Report, just do a Google search and you can find it. You'll see that it is a news aggregation site. What happens is the editor at the Drudge Report, which is a man named Matt Drudge primarily, simply selects stories that are interesting to Drudge. And they provide these very simple links to them, like you can see in the screenshot of the Drudge Report. It's a very plain page. So why does it have so much influence? Why am I calling it the most important internet news site for politics? Well, the Drudge Report became significant back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was impeached. The internet was really just starting to get going with influence in American society at that time. And there was this guy named Matt Drudge who was a would-be reporter in Washington, D.C., who was interested in politics, who created his own private blog website and called it the Drudge Report. And he happened to know a woman who knew Monica Lewinsky, who was the intern that Bill Clinton had an affair with in the White House. So Monica Lewinsky told this other woman, Linda Tripp, all her sorrows over this affair she was having with the president. And Linda Tripp then passed this information on to Matt Drudge. And Matt Drudge started posting it on his blog. This is how the world found out about this controversy, this scandal in the White House. And Matt Drudge was smart enough that he only leaked out a little bit of information at a time, which kept people day after day coming back to his website to find out what was happening next. Well, while they were there, poking around, trying to find out what he may have knew about Monica Lewinsky, they would see the other links that he had on his website to other things, and they'd click on them too. And so in that way, his website began to drive traffic to other stories, other websites out there. And over the time of the Bill Clinton-Monica Lewinsky scandal, which lasted for months, matter of fact, it lasted more than a year, people got in the habit of going to the Drudge Report to see what would happen next. And they got in the habit of clicking on links while they were there to other stories. And that habit continued even after the Bill Clinton scandal was over. To where today, the Drudge Report gets about 1 billion visits each month from people. Now, it gets so many visits that as soon as Matt Drudge posts one of these links to one of these stories that he finds interesting, suddenly millions, literally millions of clicks will be funneled that direction to that website. Suddenly millions of people across the world will become aware of that story, whatever it is. And once they are all aware of that story, the other people in the news industry feel an obligation to be aware of it also. And so even people that despise Matt Drudge and hate that his little website has such influence, and I'm talking about the directors and producers and reporters in other big mainstream websites like the New York Times and CNN, etc., they feel an obligation to go to the Drudge Report every day and see what he's linking to. What he's telling these billion people that come to his website is important so that they can be aware of it. So in that way, the Drudge Report has become the main driver of internet traffic dealing with politics. And as a consequence, all these other news sources have to pay attention to the Drudge Report also. So while there was a time in American history decades ago where the New York Times was the news source that dominated the news, that it basically told everybody else what was important, which then led other news distributors and news producers, such as CBS News or the Washington Post or whatever it is, led them to then cover stories that the New York Times had. That role has now been replaced by the Drudge Report. Editors at the New York Times look at the Drudge Report every day. They hate that they do, but they do, to see what Drudge is thinking is important, so that then they know what they have to cover to remain relevant for their audience too. So if you aren't aware of the Drudge Report, you've never visited the Drudge Report, I suggest that you do, to see what he thinks is important, so that you'll realize what the political elite out there are finding and thinking is important too. Now let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, what is an affiliated news website? Is it a website that's independent of other websites? Is it part of a state government? Is it part of a political party? Or is it part of some other big news organization? An affiliated news website is part of another big news organization. So, for example, CNN, the cable news network, which has a big television network, also has a website. It's affiliated with the news network. What is an example of citizen journalism? Is it someone using a cell phone to video a shooting? Is it someone writing a letter to an editor of a newspaper? Is it a CNN reporter who has a United States passport? Or is it somebody exercising their right to vote? Citizen journalism, as one example, is somebody using a cell phone to make a video of a police shooting. In this way, they, as a private person, can engage in news production and then get it out there for the world to see. The Real Clear Politics website is an example of what kind of website? Is it an independent news producer? Is it a news aggregator? Is it a group blog? Or is it a social media platform? Real Clear Politics is a news aggregator. Real Clear Politics, generally speaking, doesn't create its own news content. It simply provides the reader with links to other news content that's been created around the internet that the editors of Real Clear Politics happen to find important. What online media source now dominates the news? Is it the New York Times? Is it CNN? Is it Facebook? Or is it the Drudge Report? The online media source that now dominates the news is the Drudge Report. All right, that completes this lesson. The next lesson will be also from Unit 10. It'll be Lesson 5 about how online news is different.